As you may recall, the appendicular skeleton includes the pectoral girdle or shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle, upper limb and lower limb bones. In this video, we are going to walk you through the pectoral and or shoulder girdle, which includes clavicle and scapula, and the upper limb bones. The bones that you are looking at is clavicle. Clavicle is a long bone which is oriented horizontally with a medial end or a sternal end, a lateral end or acromial end. The shaft or the body of the bone is S-shaped with the forward convex on the medial end and forward concave on the lateral end. Now, the superior surface of the bone is just subcutaneous, okay, as doesn't have very much bony landmarks. But when you look at the inferior surface of the bone right here, I think we can see a groove right there, a subclavian groove. And then on the lateral end, we have two bony landmarks here we want to learn. The conoid tubercle and trapezoid line. These two actually give attachment to the coracoclavicular ligament with two parts. The conoid ligament attaches here and the trapezoid ligament attaches there. Also good to know that on the inferior surface, close to the medial end, around here, right there, there is an impression actually for the ligament, which is between the rib bone and clavicle, the costoclavicular ligament. Scapula is a triangular flat bone. When we say triangular, means it has three borders, these borders, and three angles. It also has two surfaces. So we are looking at the posterior surface of the bone. As you can see on the posterior surface of the bone, there is a bony landmark here known as spine of a scapula. That when we follow that all the way laterally, by the way, this is lateral side, so all the way laterally, it becomes a process known as acromion. And as you recall from the clavicle, that is the acromion that right here articulates with the clavicle. And back to the posterior surface, the spine of a scapula divides the posterior surface in two areas. This area known as supraspinous fossa, and this area is referred to as infraspinous fossa. Now, if I flip the bone actually like this, we can see the anterior surface of the bone, also known as costal surface. As you can see, this surface has a little bit impression here, right there, which referred to as subscapular fossa. Subscapular fossa. Okay, now I'm going to flip the bone again and looking at the posterior side. I'm going to walk you through the borders here. Okay, now this border is referred to as medial border or vertebral border. This border is lateral border or axillary border. And then the last but not least, the superior border. On the superior border, we have a little, actually a small notch here, known as suprascapular notch. Suprascapular notch. Okay. Now, when it comes to the angles, we have superior angle right there, the inferior angle right here, and then lateral angle. But the lateral angle is a little bit truncated, right? It has a big mass, and that actually, this articular surface here is known as glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa. Then practically glenoid cavity is on the lateral angle, okay? This cavity articulates with the head of the humerus like this, and they form actually the shoulder joint or glenohumeral joint. Okay, now we have two tubercles associated with the scapula, one superior to the glenoid cavity right there. Maybe I can zoom in that you can see better actually tubercle like that. Okay, here it is, the supraglenoid tubercle and infraglenoid tubercle right there. Good to know that this area of the scapula where the glenoid cavity is on the lateral angle, this part is known as neck of the scapula or scapular neck. Now, the last thing that I want to actually mention about the clavicle, the scapula, is a bony projection right there known as coracoid process. Humerus is a long bone. Humerus, or the arm bone, is a long bone. So when we say a bone is long, good to know that each long bone has a shaft and two ends. The ends of the long bone are referred to as epiphyses, proximal and distal epiphyses, and then the shaft is referred to as diaphysis. Okay, now I'm going to put the bone in the anatomical position, and we're going to actually go with or through the upper limb or the proximal end of the humerus. Okay, so on the proximal end of the bone, we have a round articular surface here known as head. Right under the head, we have the neck. However, this is referred to as anatomical neck, and we will see in a second why we call that anatomical neck. Okay, right below to the neck, anatomical neck, we have two tubercles, also known as tuberosity, the lesser tubercle and greater tubercle. The greater tubercle has three small surfaces known as facet. So if I can actually hold the bone like that, okay, perfect. I can see the facets here. Here's the superior facet, middle, and inferior facet. These facets give attachment to the rotator cuff muscles. Okay, three of the rotator cuff muscles. Okay. Between the tubercles, we have a groove right there. It's known as intertubercular groove or bicipital groove. And the reason that we call that bicipital groove is the long head of biceps passes through this groove. Okay? Now, when we come down, actually along the anterior border of the greater tubercle right here, there is a border. And there is a border here as well. So these are referred to as lateral and medial lip of the intertubercular groove. The lateral lip here and medial lip is there. Now, right below to the tubercles, somewhere around here, that area of the proximal end is referred to as surgical neck. Okay. Now, we are going to zoom out that we can go with the shaft of the bone. Okay? Now, when I follow the lips all the way down along the lateral lip, on the shaft of the bone on the lateral aspect, there is a bony projection here, which is like V shape. So maybe I can zoom in that you can see better V here. See that right there? This one. That is called actually deltoid tuberosity. Then you can imagine deltoid muscle attaches to the deltoid tuberosity. Right behind the deltoid tuberosity on the posterior surface of the shaft, we have a really shallow groove right there. This is called radial groove or a spiral groove. That groove, or sulcus, even radial sulcus, that is for a radial nerve. Now we want to go with the distal end of the bone. So I'm going to zoom in that you can see better, or have the better view of the distal end. Okay. On the distal end, we have two condyles that they are actually articular surface, two epicondyles, two supraepicondylar or supracondylar ridges. Okay? So let's go with articular surfaces known as condyle, or condyles which are articular surface. On the lateral aspect, remember, when you want to orient yourself to this articular surface, always look at the head. Head faces medially, then that is medial end, or medial side, sorry, that is medial side, and that is lateral side, right? On the lateral side of the distal end, right here is an articular surface known as capitulum. Capitulum, okay? Capitulum means a small head. Then that articulates with the head of the radius, okay? Right there, with the impression on the head of the radius right there. Okay. Medial to the capitulum, there is an articular surface known as trochlea. Right there is pulley shape, trochlea. And trochlea articulates with the trochlear notch of the ulna, like this. Beautiful, look at here. So then that is trochlear notch of the ulna. Okay, these are condyles of the humerus. Now, above the medial condyle, above the trochlea, which is, by the way, is like a medial condyle, that is medial epicondyle. Medial epicondyle. And, or as you recall, the layman terminology is called funny bone. Behind the medial epicondyle, right here, you see there is a groove, as beautifully actually shown here. That groove is for ulnar nerve. Then you can imagine fracture of the medial epicondyle with displacement might damage the ulnar nerve. Right superior to the medial epicondyle, right there, is medial supracondylar ridge. Okay. Now going on the lateral side, on the lateral side we have lateral epicondyle, and then superior to the lateral epicondyle, the lateral supracondylar ridge. Okay, this lateral supracondylar ridge gives actually attachment to some muscles, whereas the medial one doesn't have any muscle attachment. Okay, so the last points that I want to mention about the distal end are three impressions or fossa, or fossae actually three, associated with some bony landmarks here. So let's go with them. Above the capitulum, right here, we have an impression known as radial fossa. Above the trochlea, right there, we have an impression known as chronoid fossa. And then you can imagine these fossae receives actually the projections from the bones. For example, the chronoid fossa receives the chronoid process of the ulna during flexion of the elbow joint. Okay, or radial fossa receives the edge of the head of the radius during flexion of the elbow joint. On the posterior aspect of the distal end of humerus, we have a fossa here known as olecranon fossa. Then that olecranon fossa receives a process of ulna, this one, which is olecranon process, during extension of the elbow joint. So then that is during extension of the elbow joint, see that fossa goes there, and during flexion, chronoid process goes to the chronoid fossa. Okay? I thought it wouldn't be bad actually to see another humerus here. See that hole here is an artifact. Normally there is no hole, such hole on the distal end. See that is chronoid fossa or olecranon fossa on the back. So that hole or foramen is artifact. When it comes to the ulna, that is a long bone as well. Okay, so when we say long bone, remember it has two ends and a shaft, diaphysis and two epiphyses, proximal, distal ends, proximal end, distal end, and the shaft. Now I'm going to put the bone in anatomical position and I'll walk you through the proximal end. On the proximal end, we have two processes here. This process known as olecranon, and this one known as chronoid. Okay, then coronoid, olecranon. Between these two, we have a notch. I'm going to turn it that you can see the notch better. The trochlear notch, right there. Trochlear notch. Now, on the lateral side of the coronoid process, right here, there is a notch known as radial notch. The radial notch articulates with the head of the radius, right there. Okay, to form the superior radio-ulnar joint. Okay, then heads up, radial notch is on the ulna. Okay, now posterior to the radial notch, we have a crest known as supinator crest, right there, and inferior to the notch, right here, is an impression known as supinator fossa. The last but not least here, there is a bony projection right there known as ulnar tuberosity, right here. That is ulnar tuberosity. Okay, that's about the proximal end of the ulna. When it comes to the shaft of the ulna, I'm going to turn the bone like that you can see the entire shaft. Is in a cross section is triangular. Okay, we are going to focus on one of the borders of the bone. Right there is called lateral border or interosseous border. And the reason that is called interosseous border is this. Then when we put the radius and ulna side by side, see there is a gap between these two bones, right? That is interosseous space, which is filled by interosseous membrane. And these two borders, I mean one from the ulna and one from the radius, give attachment to this interosseous membrane. Okay. Now when it comes to the distal end of the ulna, so there is an articular surface known as head, then head of the ulna is on the distal end, and a bony projection known as styloid process. Styloid process. Actually I should hold the bone like that you can see better of the head and the styloid process. Radius is the long bone located on the lateral side of the forearm, of course, right? So it has two ends, the proximal or superior end, distal or inferior end, and the shaft or diaphysis. So I'm going to put the bone in anatomical position and zoom in on the proximal end that we can see better view of that. Okay, here it is. Here is the head of the radius. Then head of the radius is on the proximal end, and on the top of the head right there, see that there is an impression known as fovea. And as you recall from the humerus, the fovea articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Okay. Now below to the head we have the neck right here, and then below to that we have a bony projection known as radial tuberosity. Radial tuberosity. Okay, let's go with the distal end, and again I need to hold the bone in anatomical position to see the distal end. Okay, now when it comes to the distal end of the radius, as you can see, the distal end is much bigger than the distal end of the ulna, right? So on the distal end we have a bony projection on the lateral side right there. It's called the styloid process. Opposite to that on the medial side we have a notch known as ulnar notch. Then again, heads up, ulnar notch is on the radius, and as you can see the ulnar notch articulates with the head of the ulna to form the distal radio-ulnar joint. Okay? Now the other thing that I want to learn about the distal end is on the dorsal aspect of the distal end right there is bony projection known as dorsal tubercle, and as you can see on the sides we have a kind of grooves for the tendon of the muscles passing by. And the last but not least, on the distal aspect of the distal end we have articular surface that articulates with some of the carpal bones to form the radiocarpal joint. Before I walk you through the bones of the hand, I need to remind you about the different regions of the hand. So when I'm going to put my hand here, here is the wrist area or carpus. Then we have proper hand or metacarpus, and then fingers or digits, right? So then the osteology or the bones of these three parts are these: the carpal bones. These are the bones that form in the skeleton of the carpus, metacarpal bones, and phalanges. So now I want to walk you through the carpal bones. Carpal bones are 8 bones located in 2 rows, a proximal row here and a distal row. Let's go through the bones from lateral to medial on the proximal row. First bone is a scaphoid, then we have lunate, then we have triquetrum right there, and pisiform. As you can see, pisiform sitting on top of the triquetrum is not on the side. And then on the distal end, from lateral to median, we have trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. And hamate actually has a bony projection right there known as humulus or hook of hamate. Now when we put the carpal bones or we articulate them together, they form an arch. So I'm going to actually make it a little bit deeper like that. So they form an arch right there known as carpal arch. Then carpal arch is converted to a tunnel by a band of connective tissue known as flexor retinaculum to a tunnel. Then carpal tunnel is right there. Okay? Metacarpal bones are 5 bones, 5 mini long bones that we number them from lateral to medial. Of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each metacarpal bone has a base, body or shaft, and head or proximal end, shaft or body, and distal end. Okay, so the base of the first metacarpal bone is a little bit interesting because it's saddle shape, and it articulates with the trapezium to form the most famous saddle joint, or also known as the first CMC or first carpometacarpal joint. Okay, when it comes to the phalanges, except thumb, which has 2 phalanges, the other fingers actually have, or each finger has 3 phalanges: proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. And also good to know that each phalanx is a mini long bone which with a base, shaft or body, and head or proximal end, distal end, and shaft or body.